Now, I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, and so I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you are doing.
In 1979, the Religious Roundtable was founded, one of 4 political advocacy groups seeking to involve more conservative Christians in politics. The next year, the Roundtable hosted the National Affairs Briefing in Dallas, Texas. Everyone was there, from Southern Baptist Convention President and racist W.A. Criswell to Thomas Cullen Davis, a filthy rich Texas oil heir who was miraculously acquitted of 2 murders during the 1970s and became born again. By the way, go look up his story for a stunning tale of rich white male privilege, because not only did he get away with allegedly killing his stepdaughter, he allegedly hired a hitman to murder his ex-wife and a judge after he got off the first time. But back to the Religious Roundtable National Affairs Briefing. I am sick and tired of hearing about all the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists and the communists coming out of the closet. It's time for God's people to come out of the closet, declared televangelist James Robinson. The Washington Post reported that the thousands of attendees were almost all white, middle class, and dressed in Sunday best style. They were old and young, men and women, ranchers, ad salesmen, miners, and businessmen, with a peppering of famous Texas multimillionaires. Pat Robertson bragged that we have enough votes to run the country. This is to whom presidential candidate Ronald Reagan delivered his not-so-subtle endorsement of the growing religious right. Such powerful and direct support of a newly consolidated religious right at the top of the 80s was a reflection of all the changes that occurred the previous decade. In the mid-70s, a number of publications and media outlets reported on the rise of evangelicals and born-again Christians that signaled a sense of collective importance to such groups. And these groups were rising in population and political power. At the Religious Roundtable briefing, attention swung wildly from theology and scripture to instruction on how to organize without violating tax laws, the practicalities of registering a congregation to vote during the Sunday service, and the importance of keeping a moral scorecard on the voting record of elected representatives. There were speeches by anti-feminists, anti-communists, anti-abortionists, and those advocating for prayer in schools. It's hard to believe that just a few years prior, some of these groups had no connection to each other or an urge to vote. After all, one survey found that roughly 70% of the 35 to 60 million people who identified as born again did not vote in 1976. But suddenly, this group was primed and ready to take part in politics. How did it happen? Growth, and some powerfully invested people pulling the strings. In this episode of Lectual Does the 70s, we'll be discussing how the decade became the debutante ball, or coming out, of the new right.
There are 10 cities in the Southwest of over 100,000 population. They and their smaller sister cities are mostly trade and jobbing centers in a region that has had the greatest population increase ratio in recent years.
I briefly addressed the Sun Belt in episode 1 of this series, but now it's time for a deep dive. This is the Sun Belt, and it was first coined by the same man, Kevin Phillips, who wrote the book In the Emerging Republican Majority, which inspired and informed Nixon. Phillips was the one who studied the trends and attitude of the South, noticing that white Democrats fleeing the party in the wake of civil rights would make excellent members of the changing Republican Party, and that they had a lot in common with disgruntled white voters in the Southwest and suburbs. The Great Migration of Black Americans occurred between 1916 and 1970, with roughly 6 million of us moving from the South, usually to urban locations. But during the last decade of the Great Migration, for the first time, the South was seeing a large influx of new residents that outnumbered the amount of people leaving. As the 70s began, the South was growing in appeal for a number of reasons. Thanks to advances in AC technology, it wasn't as hot as it used to be, the sun was still sweltering, but now air conditioning was available pretty much everywhere, and heat waves were no longer as deadly. There were a bunch of new factories, which meant opportunities to find work, even though you may recall a lot of those new factories were relocated from the north and moved to the south because there were fewer labor unions and less expectations to pay employees fairly or offer benefits. In 1977, Fortune magazine declared that the Sun Belt was booming in great part because it's pro-business and northern cities, by and large, aren't.
What a divine place to live. Such charming cottages. Why anyone would want to live or go anywhere else is beyond me.
Leaders of the South, who wanted to attract as many businesses and residents as possible, realized that if they wanted investment dollars and talent in the region, they had to erase the South's old reputation of backwardness and bigotry. Southern politicians, though not embarrassed over the segregation wars that exploded in the 60s, publicly acted as moderates when it came to race. Black Southern voters grew in number, black politicians gained more power within the political bureaucracy, and outward displays of racism were traded in for microaggressions and dog whistles. Southern leaders also rolled out the red carpet for businesses by enacting right-to-work laws that restricted labor organizations and limited union fundraising and offered long-term tax abatements, free land, and facilities. In 1970, half of the annual foreign investment in America was in the South. Between 1970 and 1990, the South's population grew by 40%. A good chunk of these newcomers were luxury car-driving retirees who purchased freshly built condos with retirement income their forefathers could have never dreamed of. Leaders of the Frost Belt, aka the industrial regions of the Northeast and Midwest, weren't really feeling the Sun Belt. They complained that their states paid the most taxes and that most of the money went to the Sun Belt. The governor of New York, Hugh Carey, was the leader of such criticism. He and his fellow Frost Belt governors formed the Coalition of Northeast Governors in 1976 to lobby Congress for more aid packages. Keep in mind that this was a period of economic crisis and stagflation. One dramatic New Yorker claimed that, like blacks, Hispanics, women, and homosexuals, Northeasterners are an oppressed minority. We are only beginning to realize how badly the federal government discriminates against us. Dragging it. Sunbelt leaders insisted that the Frost Belt's decline was due to bad policies and leadership, and then organized counter-lobbyist groups to ensure they'd keep getting generous aid in things like federal agricultural programs. Such programs helped grow agriculture businesses in the South, but it wasn't just factories and agriculture bringing new wealth and influence to the Sunbelt. Aerospace and defense industries built headquarters in Sunbelt locations like LA, Houston, Las Vegas, Atlanta, and North Carolina, which built more modern industries and jobs. During the 60s, NASA brought huge money to the Southeast with its multi-billion-dollar Project Apollo moon program, erecting the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Then there were the tax breaks involved with the lucrative and burgeoning southern oil industry, bringing massive wealth to Sunbelt areas like Texas. Isn't it funny how many Southerners are supposedly anti-government and self-reliant, but much of the South's late 20th century growth came from federal programs and, dare I say it, handouts? The South's lack of unions, along with its job growth, meant union decline in the North and Midwest. This coincided perfectly with the growth in service industry jobs like fast food and retail, where any potential for new union organizing was weak. This pivot away from union jobs in the 70s set the tone for a country increasingly hostile towards unions and workers' rights. The growth of the Sun Belt in the 70s was evident by the rise in Southern culture in other regions of the United States. For starters, there was a decline of baseball in favor of football. Baseball, long America's favorite pastime, was symbolically and historically attached to urban areas. There were only 3 major teams in the South, while the National Football League had 6 teams in the South. The Dallas Cowboys would become America's team, and the coach, Tom Landry, became an American hero and Sun Belt symbol. In 1979, it was reported that Dallas Cowboy games were broadcasted by CBS more than any other team, which might have been linked to this iconic poster of the grossly underpaid Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. It sold around 1 million copies when it was released in 1977. Television movies, commercials, exercise videos, and more would follow. The 70s is also the period that television coverage of football began to include pre-game shows and halftime programs, further heroicizing players and coaches along with heightening fan experience. Another influence shipped nationwide from the South was country music. This bit of Southern cultural nationalism was exhibited through groups like Lynyrd Skynyrd and hits like Loretta Lynn's Coal Miner's Daughter in 1970 and John Denver's Thank God I'm a Country Boy in 1975.
Well, I was born to coal miner's daughter in a cabin on a hill in Butcher Hollow.
But my personal favorite is Dolly Parton's original rendition of I Will Always Love You in 1974.
Oh, but above all of this, I wish you love, and I will always love you.
Country radio stations grew across the country in the decades following the 70s, and the music had cultural currency. Newspapers documented the rising influence. One 1971 paper stated, "Country music, once generally dismissed as the doleful maunderings of illiterate hillbillies, is attracting an ever-widening audience and is spread from its base in the South Central states to become a programming staple on a majority of the nation's radio stations." Richard Nixon attended the unveiling of the $15 million Grand Ole Opry Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee in March 1974. He played the piano and also played with a yo-yo. This was at the same time that he was facing mounting pressure of the Watergate scandal, demonstrating that even in a time of crisis, Nixon had time for country fans, those most likely to be his core constituency. Country lyrics documented and sometimes romanticized the lives of poor whites, criticized the government, and generally encompassed the full span of populist and conservative beliefs that come to mind when we think of the South. The culture that came along with country music, aka redneck culture, pickup trucks, cowboy boots and hats, the Confederate flag, became trendy to Northerners and Midwesterners who had never ventured below the Mason-Dixon. Redneck, once an epithet for poor landless white Southerners, became a source of pride and working-class patriotism in which even Northerners and Midwesterners could share Southern sentiments about survival, government interference, liberals, and welfare-loving Negroes. Speaking of those welfare-loving Negroes, the topic of welfare itself was something that mainstreamed and legitimized Sunbelt beliefs to a nationwide audience. Southern leaders had long been against the idea of welfare, demonstrated by their lack of enthusiasm in the years following the Great Depression and their rejection of New Deal politics. They were therefore the polar opposites of Northern leaders who embraced social welfare programs during the mid-20th century. But by the time the mid-70s rolled around, Northern whites disliked programs that would help minorities get welfare and job training, and also hated busing, affirmative action, and urban renewal. By the late 70s, it was commonplace for Northern politicians to oppose such social programs, using dog whistle politics and appealing to white voters. So by rejecting the welfare state, the Sun Belt was now mainstream in political ideology and race relations. So in the early 70s, when wealthy businessmen moved down south, away from cities ran by Democrats who championed civil rights and welfare programs, they were naturally attracted to the new Republican Party that rose from the ashes of the now dead Southern Democrat faction. It's important to note that in 1971, the first mandated round of legislative redistricting occurred. Thanks to a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 60s, states were now required to redraw legislative districts every 10 years to reflect population changes. The 70s saw a boom of lawsuits about gerrymandering, a political tool that would hurt the voting impact of minorities for decades to come. The influence of the South and its populist, middle-class, anti-establishment leanings would have ripple effects on American conservatism. Conservatism had long been associated with the wealthy Northeastern elite, who made fortunes through Wall Street, had Ivy League educations, and belonged to country clubs. But the Sun Belt's economic growth, which meant more people and more electoral votes and congressional seats, changed not only the face of conservatism, but conservative politics. In 1971, a confidential confidential memo titled The Attack on American Free Enterprise System was published by Lewis F. Powell and would serve as a rallying cry for the ultra-wealthy Americans who felt threatened by the rising interest in radical politics, consumer prioritization, and corporate regulations that had emerged in the 60s. In 1973, the Heritage Foundation was founded by Paul Weyrich and Edwin Follner Jr. $250,000 was donated by beer empire heir Joseph Coors, whose family was long known for its conservative, anti-civil rights, anti-welfare, and anti-hippie stances. Coors' own son had become a hippie while attending the University of Colorado, and he was the first investor convinced by Weyrich's vision of militant national institutions that would maintain the American values that had long enabled his family's wealth. The Heritage Foundation published materials and held conferences on pro-business and anti-government stances and provided advice and assistance to Capitol Hill politicians. They published Heritage Backgrounders, short op-ed style publications instead of thick, wordy, objective policy papers for politicians on the go. Though Coors was the first investor, millions more would be given by various wealthy conservatives who wanted to sway politics in their favor without sinking astronomical funds into single candidates. The Heritage Foundation was soon joined by others like the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution, and the Cato Institute. Weyrich also founded the American Legislation Exchange Council, a group that initiated legislative fights surrounding conservative issues in every state. Most of the lobby group's financial support came from the billionaire oil tycoon Richard Mellon Scaife. On Capitol Hill, lobbying groups funded by ultra-rich conservatives like Scaife and later the Kochs were joined by corporations hoping to end New Deal infrastructure and the expansion of workplace and environmental regulations. But these groups were not the people. No, the people, the folks who made up the silent majority and who were terrified of the increasingly secular and equal society, needed to be mobilized. This is how the ultra-rich could sway politics and save money at the same time, mobilizing and educating the group of Americans who best suited the job: religious fundamentalists. Richard Viguerie was a conservative Goldwater Republican and activist who in the 60s began compiling a database of Barry Goldwater and George Wallace donors, organized by concerns and complaints. Operating under his belief that the mainstream media was biased against conservative issues, he began a direct mailing company. With his vast and ever-growing list of conservative voters, he sent targeted mail on behalf of various political action committees and groups like the Gun Owners of America. Though direct mailing would become a key feature of both parties during the 70s, it was Viguerie who introduced and mastered the concept. By 1975, he had over 10 million names on about 250 mailing lists. It was during this time that he became a senior member of a group of conservatives who wanted to expand the movement through think tanks, political action committees, and training institutes. They also encouraged homeschooling and private Christian schooling, which would allow children to grow up fully in the ideology machine. I've written extensively on this topic, so be sure to check out links below this video for more on evangelicals and schooling. The success to the new right's growth and consolidation of power lay in 4 key actions. First, the new right needed to identify single-issue voter groups and unite them against a common enemy. These single-issue voters were Stop ERA housewives and mothers, the NRA gun toters, anti-abortion Catholics, anti-busing racists, etc. Next, there needed to be multi-issue, broad-spectrum conservative organizations who served a number of functions despite having less mainstream appeal. As Paul Weyrich quipped, "Organization is our bag. We preach and teach nothing but organization." These organizations had money to fund single-issue voter groups and leaders who could pontificate well on such issues. They also could research and teach single-issue groups how to better lobby, fundraise, protest, qualify for ballot initiatives, and print their own newspapers. I cannot overstate the importance of organizations and think tanks like Heritage Foundation providing the capital and resources for single-issue voters to mobilize and be taken seriously on a national stage. The third key to success were new forms of communication, namely direct mail. As Viggory and associates believed the media was controlled by liberals, they wanted to go around mainstream media to directly reach their audience. Because post-Watergate reforms limited individual donations to political candidates, it became imperative for political candidates to have huge databases of small donors instead of small Rolodexes of a few key wealthy people. Viggory had a database of over 15 million conservatives who had donated money to various politicians who he could send fundraising solicitations, propaganda, and organization prompts directly through the mail. Sending mail to conservative voters could propel them into action, like asking them to send letters or make phone calls by the thousands to congressmen. The fourth key for the new right was an emphasis on coalition politics. When Viggory and his cohorts first assembled to become what would become known as the New Right in 1974, it was in response of outrage to Gerald Ford appointing the liberal conservative and 1964 Goldwater opponent Norman Rockefeller to the vice presidency. Viggory, Weyrich, and others saw that they had common threats and needed to work together to defeat them and achieve their goals. What were those common goals? First, the leaders of the New Right were pissed that America seemed less interested in global dominance after Vietnam. They were also angry about the thawing Cold War, aka the debutante, which really intensified when Nixon became the first sitting president to visit Moscow in 1972. Nixon also famously visited China that same year, and the images from that trip were the first time the American public had seen new images from the country in over 20 years. In response to Nixon's visit, and photos of him awkwardly holding chopsticks over a Chinese banquet, American-style Chinese food rose in popularity. Though an American creation, chop suey had long been popular, suddenly people were interested in Cantonese and Szechuanese-style dishes. Nixon and accompanying aides and journalists were served fried rice, dumplings, steamed chicken with coconut, shark fins, and Peking duck, which became quite a trendy food item. After the trip, the number of Chinese restaurants in America doubled. New right leaders distrusted China and opposed negotiating with Soviets or communists in general. Members of the New Right were also against the Panama Canal Treaty, which had been in negotiations for 12 years, but ultimately came to be blamed on Jimmy Carter. In fact, a large majority of Americans opposed Panamanian control of the canal by 1978. Ronald Reagan insisted, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we intend to keep it." But as historian Thomas Borstelman pointed out, American control of the 10-mile-wide strip through the middle of Panama was roughly akin to another nation operating the Mississippi River and a few miles of land on the other side. After the treaty was adopted, despite right-wing propaganda and lobbying against it, 20 congressional seats were flipped to Republican in 1978 and 1980, and conservatives became endeared to Reagan. But we'll be back to him in the next episode. The next area of concern for members of the New Right was targeting elitism, which they strategically linked to liberals. Typically and historically, conservatives had hated grassroots activism and drew support from people who had a sizable stake in the established order. You know, the people with money and power. But eyeing the rise of populist, anti-elitist, and anti-government sentiments exacerbated by the rise of Sunbelt culture, New Right leaders knew they needed to shed their own history of elitism and link it to the liberals. It was those pesky liberals, pointy-headed intellectuals who were the creators of affirmative action, integration, and busing. They were the ones introducing new and radical school books and curricula, dominating universities, and it was their ideology being welcomed by national news media, or so the story goes. In 1978, when Carter's tax commissioner moved to withdraw tax exemption status from Christian schools that refused to integrate, the hatred of the liberal elite was at a fever pitch. Over 125,000 letters were sent to Carter and the IRS in protest. Debates over taxes are a key component of the rise of the New Right that we'll come back to in the final episode of Lectual Does the 70s when discussing the Reagan culmination. And that brings me to the final area of concern for the New Right: family values. Everything from feminism to abortion to integration were spun as attacks on the family, and this was after sustained and vigorous propaganda. For example, many conservatives were not actually outraged by the passing of Roe v. Wade in 1973, Moderate Republicans didn't want to address anti-abortion sentiments at their 1974 convention, and many conservatives weren't eager to attack abortion either for a few reasons. First of all, the Roe v. Wade decision emphasized individual rights and rights to privacy, which was appealing to conservatives who hated government intrusion. Also in the early 70s, 70% of the National Right to Life Committee were Catholic, and conservative evangelicals had historical and ideological beef with the Catholics. Evangelical theologian Harold O.J. Brown summed it up thusly: at that point, a lot of Protestants reacted almost automatically. If the Catholics are for it, we should be against it. The first and most prominent anti-abortion evangelical was the theologian Francis Schaeffer, who wrote Whatever Happened to the Human Race with future Surgeon General C. Everett Koop in 1979. The book linked abortion to torture and suicide, slavery, and anti-Semitism, and declared abortion the murder of innocence. But more importantly, the book emphasized that evangelicals should cooperate with non-evangelicals to eradicate abortion and achieve wider success in defending family values. Obedience is a central theme of fundamentalists, and therefore hierarchies are a key component. This includes obedience to God, who is at the top of the pyramid, obedience to ideologists, bosses, pastors, and so forth, but on the most basic level, obedience within a family. In right-wing circles, the family's important function in society rests on there being a strong male leader who the wife and children are obedient to. Therefore, it can never be overstated how important family values are to maintaining and strengthening the conservative right. When Phyllis Schlafly fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, it was on the basis of protecting the family by championing the privileges of housewives, who only receive such luxuries by being loyal and submissive wives.
The women's liberationists running down motherhood and saying that it's a menial, degrading career, and that the home is a prison from which women should be liberated and brought out into this wonderful workforce. Now, the home is the most fulfilling place for most women. And let's not run it down. And I also want to guarantee to the woman who wants to make marriage and motherhood her full-time career, her legal right to do that. Because one of the first things that the Equal Rights Amendment would do is to invalidate the state laws that make it the obligation of the husband to support his wife.
But of course, these arguments about protecting the family didn't stop at sexism or misogyny. When anti-busing advocate Louise Day Hicks was running for the Boston City Council, she claimed that there were at least 100 black people walking around in the black community who have killed white people during the last 2 years. This is despite the fact that the data showed that out of 223 murders committed from 1973 to 1974, only 24 involved a black person killing a white one. Her racist rhetoric allowed her to attract the support necessary to fight for her pro-family agenda of keeping white children separated from black ones. Alice Moore, the West Virginian mother of 4, who in 1974 led the charge against letting spicy literature in schools, first targeted the rise of sex education in public schools, which was another target of family values crusaders.
So what's so different about you?
I got my first period today.
Titles like 1968's Is the Little Red Schoolhouse the Place to Teach Raw Sex argued that parents were the only appropriate source of information. In 1970, Nixon had signed Title X into law, a program dedicated to family planning, education, and services. Between 1969 and 1976, there was a huge increase of school districts teaching contraception and sex ed. It was during the 70s that sex ed became more about preventing pregnancy rather than preventing teenage sex. By the late 70s, about 35% of private and public schools had sex ed programs, but the content in respective districts wasn't always the same. Some employed older programming and ideas, while others embodied the spirit of the sexual revolution. New sex ed films of this period were much more explicit than those previously made. Some even showed interracial couples and discussed homosexuality or questioned gender roles. For more on sex ed in American schools, check out episode 4 of Let's Talk About Sex History. In 1977, Dr. James Dobson founded Focus on the Family, leading the charge against sex ed in opposition to gay rights. That same year, the National Federation for Decency, later known as American Family Association, was founded and lobbied local stations and threatened television and advertising executives for promoting sexuality and positive portrayals of homosexuality. They even singled out major corporations like Sears for advertising during episodes of Three's Company and Charlie's Angels, which they saw as salacious. All Also that year, Pat Robinson launched the Christian Broadcasting Network, adding to the growth of televangelist culture.
It's the 700 Club. On this edition, the role of Israel in coming world events. Now, here's your host, Pat Robertson.
2 years later, Beverly LaHaye founded Concerned Women for America, which emphasized biblical values and detested feminism. It amassed more funding and members than the National Organization for Women. LaHaye was inspired to start the group after a 1978 Barbara Walters interview with Betty Friedan, in which Friedan claimed to speak for American women. LaHaye would emphasize that feminism was anti-God and anti-family. A central cause to the rise and backlash to feminism was feminism's growing acceptance of lesbians and homosexuality. Nobody embodies the fight against homosexuality quite like the country singer, orange juice spokesman, and activist Anita Bryant.
And
Security agents.
No, let him stay.
No.
Let him stay.
well, at least it's a fruit pie.
Let's pray for him right now. Anita, let's pray.
Father, I want to ask that you forgive him
That we love him.
and that we love him and that we're praying for him to be delivered from his deviant lifestyle, Father.
That was Anita's face being smashed with a pie. Why? The former Miss Oklahoma, once a 60s pop star, had embarked on quite the crusade. In 1977, liberals on the Miami-Dade County Commission passed an ordinance making discrimination against homosexuals illegal. Bryant and others like her believed that because homosexuals can't produce, they needed to recruit children. After collecting tons of signatures calling for a referendum of the ordinance, she, with the help of allies, launched Save Our Children, Inc. It's important to note that the Florida orange juice industry was really heating up in the 70s thanks to the growth of the Sun Belt, and Anita had a lot of clout.
Hey, come back, little orange bird.
Save Our Children, Inc. was supported by conservatives like Pat Robinson and Jerry Falwell. This fight would play out nationally and even sparked a boycott of orange juice among the gays, which some cleverly called a gaycott. In some San Francisco bars, it was reported that screwdrivers were dumped in favor of Greyhounds or vodka with grape juice. Save Our Children hired a political consultant who came up with an ad that contrasted the wholesome images of Florida's Orange Bowl to San Francisco's Pride Parade. The same people who turned San Francisco into a hotbed of homosexuality want to do the same thing to Dade County, the ad claimed. The fierce Anita-led campaign attracted special election attention, and the repeal of the Miami-Dade Ordinance passed by a whopping 70%. This crushing victory in the name of family values influenced many conservatives to get more involved with politics and showed the importance of single-issue voting. Despite being hit in the face by a pie in Iowa in 1977 and becoming a punchline on merchandise lambasting her, the victory emboldened Anita Bryant. She would continue to speak out against gay rights and remained a darling of the new right until 1980, when she and her husband divorced and she was essentially thrown away for not being in line with family values. You thought you were safe? In the 1970s, a resurgence of religious fundamentalism took place in all three major religions, but none was more pronounced on American soil than Christianity. Not only was there the newfound alliance between evangelicals and Catholics that I mentioned earlier, but a strengthening and rise of evangelicals with the born-again movement. Even king of the counterculture Bob Dylan participated in the born-again movement of the 70s, no doubt attracting more people who would become Jesus freaks, rocking long hair and decked out in tie-dye. In 1972, a Miami Herald article detailed frustrated Jewish leaders attempting to stop their youth from getting swept up in Jesus freak mania. Christian rock and contemporary style music began replacing traditional hymns in cool churches across the nation. Televangelism, which I discuss at length in this video, grew during the period. Not all members of the political right were evangelicals. The Conservative Caucus Political Action Committee founder, Howard Phillips, was Jewish. Paul Weyrich, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, was Catholic. But these men all had the same goals and understood that bringing out evangelical voters hinged on magnifying cultural issues. They seized on the evangelical moment of reckoning. Bringing out these voters also meant convincing them that working with groups they usually disputed was the key to success. Enter Jerry Falwell, who Wayrich and Associates enticed into creating an organization that would mobilize Christian voters after the IRS attack on racist private schools. The organization was, of course, the Moral Majority. Another component of the New Right strategy was targeting the youth. Both political parties were eager to court 11 million potential new voters after Congress lowered the legal voting age to 18 in 1971. Raising the youth to be loyal party voters is strongest among conservatives, perhaps best summed up by Jerry Falwell's direction to get them saved, get them baptized, get them registered. Though they obsessed over family values and rejected a growing acceptance of non-marital sex, evangelicals actually left their mark on the sexual revolution in their own way, as observed by historian Gillian Frank. A lot of sex advice literature was produced by and for evangelical women in the 70s, a part of a larger evangelical publishing boom. According to Frances Fitzgerald, evangelical women published a spate of books arguing that women were by nature different from men and could achieve fulfillment and true femininity only by surrendering their lives to their husbands. Part of surrendering meant being really skilled at sex. Anita Bryant quipped in a 1972 book, "Christian sex is everything. Married sex, as with all else God has created, is beautiful." No-fault divorce laws were more numerous and divorce rates climbed. Single women were out in the workplace. Casual sex was becoming more accepted. In the face of all of this, evangelical messaging towards women about sex became a lot more encouraging and permissive. Beverly and Tim LaHaye wrote a 1976 bestseller that emphasized that the ultimate objective of sex is orgasm for both the husband and wife, a quite revolutionary idea for many evangelicals who believe the primary role of sex to be procreation. A key feature of these books was the looming threat of home wreckers, a fear intensified by the rise of women in the workplace. Beverly LaHaye wrote that men's secretaries were desperately lonely and will pay any price for a period of tenderness. Texts like Maribel Morgan's 1974 bestseller, The Total Woman, told women to prepare for sexual intercourse every night for a week, reminding them that all day long your husband is surrounded at the office by dazzling secretaries who emit clouds of perfume. Mabel offered Total Woman courses, which by 1975, over 15,000 evangelical women signed up for. One testimonial claimed, "My husband wasn't even speaking to me when I began, but I did all my assignments. He has never bought me a gift before, but this week he bought me 2 nighties, 2 rose bushes, and a can opener." The assignments were, of course, sexual acts, lots of new positions, indulging your husband's sexual fantasies, and not being scared to try things, and naughty activities like donning lingerie. Isn't it pretty ironic that these evangelical texts encourage women to have sex with their husbands in exchange for gifts, money, and ultimately security? I think there's a word for that. Evangelical sex writers also emphasized that men were stressed out at their jobs, just a healthy feature of capitalism, and that it was the wife's duty to provide sexual comfort. As Morgan put it, "At the end of a long day, your husband especially needs your compliments. Put your husband's tattered ego back together again. He needs to be pampered, loved, and restored through food and sex." After all, in the 70s, good Christian women were competing with more readily available porn and sexually liberated women. A 1970 article detailed, 5 years ago, about 90 theaters around the country showed sexploitation movies or skin flicks. Now there are more than 600, and the number is growing weekly. Some have abandoned seedy downtown areas for the suburbs. Many are clean and respectable looking, with admission prices as high as $5 in big cities. But pornography became even more available to men when VHS debuted in 1977. A typical VHS player was around $5,500 in today's money. A 1979 article detailed the phenomenon of VHS tapes, with salesmen saying the biggest sellers were, you guessed it, porn films. Said one man, "A lot of people don't want to see the same movie twice. For those who are interested in pornography, that's not a problem. They seem to like to see the same film again and again." Enthusiasm for pornography and its rapidly growing industry also drove up anti-pornography movements, usually headed by women, including radical feminists and evangelicals. As I've demonstrated in this episode, the consolidation of the New Right through propaganda of key single voter issues would have ripple effects on both politics and America at large. And by ripple effects, I mean putting immeasurable amounts of power and wealth into the hands of already powerful billionaires. Direct mailing would eventually give way to targeted emailing and even the now familiar targeted campaign ads you see on Facebook, YouTube, and other social media sites, where propaganda and misinformation is readily available for those living in echo chambers. The combination of Christian homeschooling, televangelism, and other Christian media, along with the drop in voting age, meant a newly emboldened generation of Christian voters who would pass their values to their children for future elections, aligning themselves with contentious single voter issues like abortion and gun rights while voting against their own class interests. More importantly, the new right's billionaire-backed ideology machine, along with the Sun Belt's influence across the country, caused Democrats to be more moderate in ideology if they wanted to gain enough votes, as would be demonstrated by the future campaigns of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Though evangelicals and other fundamentalists liked Jimmy Carter at first, they didn't like his soft stances on international politics and his relative tolerance of the political left. When Ronald Reagan endorsed the religious right at the National Affairs briefing, he was endorsing their way of life and assuring them that he was the strong hero they needed. The hero who would defeat the problems of secularism, the hippie freaks, the black radicals, and everything else that threatened family values. But Reagan would not just purport himself to be a hero for this group. He would also stand for the rights of the fiscally conservative libertarians and neocons, and those who wanted to escape the economic woes of the 70s into better times and fatter wallets. In the final episode of Lectual Does the 70s, we'll be discussing the rise of privatization, the tax revolution, and the culmination of 1970's biggest problems into Reagan's crushing presidential campaign.
Want to see more great long format videos like this? Well, you can, over on Patreon, where a $1 to $3 monthly pledge grants you access to exclusive videos and essays. Plus, your pledge produces more great free content like this. Check the link in the description box below for more information. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe.